Doctors with disabilities exist in small but measurable numbers. How did they navigate their journey? What were the challenges? What are the benefits to patients and to their peers? What can we learn from their experiences? My name is Lisa Meeks, and I'm thrilled to bring you the Docs with Disabilities podcast. Join me as I interview docs, nurses, psychologists, OTs, PTs, pharmacists, dentists, and the list goes on. I'll also be interviewing the researchers and policymakers that ensure medicine remains an equal opportunity profession. Hi, Lisa here, and welcome back to the Docs with Disabilities podcast. In today's episode, we are pulling a Freaky Friday. I am stepping into the role as narrator, while Sophia, our producer and often narrator, is stepping into my role as the interviewer. I'm particularly thrilled to narrate this interview. Today, we are joined by a group of physicians from the University of Colorado Medical School that published a paper in the Journal of Surgical Education about their experiences accommodating a student with a physical disability during a surgery clerkship. I have the distinct pleasure of having been part of this writing team and to have met these amazing clinician educators during my time as a visiting professor at Colorado. At the center of this paper and first author is Dr. Rosa Malloy Post, a physician wheelchair user who is the subject of this case report. Dr. Teresa Jones from the Department of Surgery, Dr. Nathaniel Brown from Anesthesiology, and the ever amazing Dr. Jennifer Adams, Assistant Dean for Clinical Clerkships, who I must say was a dream to work with and is very focused on inclusive medical education. In this episode, Sophia interviews the group about the processes behind the group's publication and the collective experiences of creating an accessible medical school rotation for a student with a physical disability and really for students with disabilities more broadly. We begin our episode, as always, with an introduction from each of our guests.
Hi, I'm Teresa Jones. I'm a general surgeon here at the Rocky Mountain Regional VA Medical Center, and I'm also one of the clerkship directors for the medical school curriculum for surgery.
Hi, I'm Rosa Malloy Post. I'm an emergency medicine resident physician at the Carolinas Medical Center in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I was, up until very recently, a medical student at the University of Colorado.
Hi, my name is Nathaniel Brown. I'm an anesthesiologist. I practice at the Rocky Mountain Regional VA Medical Center, and I am an assistant professor in the Department of Anesthesiology.
And I'm Jennifer Adams. I'm a general internist and a professor of medicine. I am our assistant dean for our clinical clerkships and curriculum. So I oversee our clinical clerkships here at the University of Colorado.
Fantastic. Thank you all. We're so excited to have you with us for this episode. I'd like to start off the interview with a question for Rosa. As a wheelchair user attending medical school, you understood that you would be required to rotate through surgery. What were your concerns about that experience, and in what ways were your anxieties either realized or quelled?
I had a multitude of anxieties stemming from some of the physical aspects of how, surgery is performed, or at least traditionally is performed, and then honestly a lot about culture and accessibility, about how I was to be viewed as a student and a learner. I think, and this is not necessarily just the culture of surgery, but really the dominant culture of medicine in general, of not being able to really think outside of the box of what a traditional doctor looks like and how the traditional aspects of medicine are practiced. And I was really pleasantly surprised that that was not the attitude whatsoever of the people I was working with in med school when we were helping design what my surgical curriculum was going to look like. It was very open-minded and very willing. A lot of what it looked like when we were starting to think about how this was going to look was really starting about like how I feel comfortable and what I can do and what my limitations are, and not really having not not having this taboo around, not being able to talk about these things, but also celebrating and really amplifying the things that I'm very much capable of doing. So there's no assumption of my abilities or my disabilities when we were beginning to form this curriculum, which was cool. And then I also felt like, you know, for those of you who have been med students in the past, like it's hard just being a med student. There's a lot of things you have to do, a lot of logistics and showing up at the right place with little information and, who to talk to and who not to talk to and the assignments and, also learning just basic medicine at the same time. And I was really pleasantly surprised that the bulk of the work of how I was going to do my surgery rotation didn't fall on me to figure out, because I've never done a surgery rotation before. And there was this attitude of like, this is not your burden to bear to tell us how you do surgery. It's for us to figure out how this is going to look for you to be successful.
As we mentioned in the introduction, you all wrote and published an article about this experience. It's titled Perioperative Clerkship Design for Students with Physical Disabilities, a Model for Implementation, and it was published in the Journal of Surgical Education in 2022. Starting with Teresa, can you share a little bit about how that paper came to be?
Absolutely. And I think, when we started talking about doing this, looking up what information was available, there really wasn't much. And so we just wanted to share the process we went through, which was really a collaboration between the School of Medicine, our staff here in the VA, just how do we give Rosa that best experience? Because it's totally within our capability. And I think, it was a lot of communication, a lot of people got involved, and people here were pretty excited. I'd say the OR staff was like, yeah, what can we do? They really participated in developing that. And I think knowing that that's a resource and that people are, you know, excited to participate was really helpful for all of this.
Given the lack of information out there, how were you able to get to a place where you felt confident that you could make this happen? In other words, where do you credit your attitude of course, this is possible, we just have to figure out how to do it?
I think it started with Jen. Jen approached us pretty early about this, and I think that was really critical, having a lot of time to have those discussions. And then getting together with the group and saying, this is what we're doing, establishing like, we are going to do this and how we're going to do this. I don't know, Jen, if you want to speak to that.
Thanks, Teresa. Sure, I'm happy to jump in. I think we started thinking about how to plan clinical clerkships for Rosa really early, which was super helpful. And I appreciate Rosa's partnership in that process. So with at least a year's lead time to start planning, really thinking about all of your clerkships and how we could best situate you in terms of meeting your requirements, thinking about what functional limitations there may or may not be, but also how you could best meet the requirements and be successful and what your goals were. So after our initial meeting, then I took my initial ideas to our clerkship director meeting without revealing who Rosa was, just let them know that we had a student coming up in the clerkships the following year who was a wheelchair user, and started asking that group to brainstorm about how they could best support the student and start thinking about what sites specifically could accommodate that. And I actually agree with Teresa. I think in addition to the OR staff feeling excited, this sort of felt like something that we could take on and wanted to think about how we could best support Rosa.
Could you explain a bit more about why the VA emerged as the best place to make this happen?
I think, the VA is such a great educational place. Our patients are very, very willing to have learners. And I don't know if that's a cultural thing, a military thing, but it also gives us a lot more time with our learners to, there's not as quick turnaround for better or for worse, but we have more time for education in general. And so we thought that would be really helpful in this case if there was any logistical problems, which there turns out there really weren't. We also have a pretty new building, so there's a lot of good accommodations from that standpoint. And then our staff, like I said, very willing to work with learners knowing that we have that time. And Nathaniel's one of our anesthesiologists here, and we approached them pretty early about the feasibility because anesthesia is so important. And I think Rosa almost got swayed to the dark side of anesthesia, but I don't know.
Almost.
Almost. Well, if you ever reconsider, I suppose, a career change, no, don't do that. One residency. We were very excited to see how we could help, how we could just sort of make it happen. So yeah, we were excited early on. Initially, I thought, it'll there won't be that much to change. There will be some, the just some sort of technical issues with making sure the bed height is low for intubation and whatnot. And then I think our first meeting together in person, Rosa, I know you were there, Teresa, you were there. I remember learning about what it is you wanted to get out of the rotation, what you could do, and realizing like we can really make this happen, right? She has a standing chair, and she has a variety of abilities to modify the world around her, as long as that world can be modified fairly minimally to suit her, which is a totally reasonable thing, right? And so I think my attitude and the attitude of my partners in the anesthesia department was very much, look, we're going to make this happen. We're not sure how, but the how question is what we're going to do. It's not the whether question, right? One of the things that I started seeing after discussing this with Rosa was just the amount of unnecessary stuff that ended up being sort of draped around the anesthesia section of the OR that I didn't even notice, like cords that you can't step on but you're supposed to step over. Like, okay, not a problem, but now it's a problem. And how do we, what do we end up doing? It had a simple solution, as you'd expect, but that's more illustrative of a change in focus, which I was very grateful for. And I loved Rosa's kind of can-do attitude, just like, let's focus on what I can do, and let me see if I can even consider anesthesia. And yes, I was very vocal in wanting her to consider it if that's what she wanted to do, and kind of address the separate question of whether or not a career in anesthesia is feasible versus a medical student experience in anesthesia. Medical student experience in anesthesia is 1,000% definitely achievable, and ultimately Dr. Molly Post chose emergency medicine, and I'm very happy that she made a good choice. I am a little sad that she didn't choose anesthesia, because I think with her in particular, I think the world of anesthesia lost a good one.
I'd like to draw Rosa back into the conversation here. You talked a bit initially about working with this team. Is there anything else you'd like to add about what it was like on your end during all of this planning?
Yeah, I mean, um, I could not have asked for a more supportive team, supportive of me, and also just like incredible communicators with each other, which, I think is so important when you're exploring a new possibility and really creating something that has not been done, that you're actively communicating with one another. I think that's a huge piece just in medicine and really in work in general that is like so important. I think working early and thinking about things that could be pitfalls early, even before, so that when we get to the actual rotation, we've already thought about these roadblocks was really important. I think working with Jennifer about just general rotations was really took a lot of anxiety away from me. There was planning and thought around what places would be the most conducive to my learning and be the most available to me. It was really important because I think, like, there's it's kind of two-sided. It's like, oh well, I want to be known for what, I can do, but I also am very keenly aware and very, and very proud in the sense that I have a disability. Like, that is part of my identity. And I think the idea of, like, well, we don't have to think about it. She can just pull herself up by her bootstraps and do whatever and get it done. We don't really have to, like, tell people that this person's coming. We're going to just treat her like everybody else is, it's such a fallacy because that's just not how the world works. And I think, like, having really, really solid communication. And I think that's really what it was. I think there's a piece with the equipment that I have. I have the privilege of being able to have a chair that stands me up a little bit, not fully, but elevates me, which is is really quintessential to me being able to do my job. And I think there's parts of that are limiting, right? Is that, like, as Dr. Brown was saying, is that, like, I have the ability to to adapt, and also I need the environment to meet me halfway. And at times, in my career and places I'm going to be, I need to figure out how to advocate for myself and also find people who will help advocate for my environment to meet me halfway, because it's would be worrisome for me to just rely on my equipment to be able to do everything for me. And I think what Dr. Brown was saying about, like, the reality of, like, being a med student and having a med student experience versus being a resident and being a physician in a certain specialty is, like, it's real. I feel like nobody is more keenly aware of my disability and my ability and my limitations as me. I made very conscious decisions about what I wanted to do and what I knew was sustainable for me in my life. I performed the tasks at hand during my surgical rotation. Like, I enjoyed it. Like, I enjoyed the medicine of it. I enjoyed the procedures of it. And I was able to complete all those things and do it well. And I also recognized that, like, you know, in 15, 20 years, like, is the way that surgery is, that there's limitations, and I could do it, but I want to preserve, my functions and my abilities for other things. Like, I don't know if my rotator cuffs would be able to do surgery when I'm 45. The new adventure is, going into my specialty, learning how to be a great emergency doctor, but also really challenging what being a good doctor and being a proceduralist looks like.
The conversation now shifts to consider specific parts of the group's publication in more detail. Listen or read along as we begin with a conversation about maintaining sterility in the OR.
One thing you talk about in your paper is the issue of maintaining sterility when you have a wheelchair in the operating room. And this is something that I know Dr. Meeks often gets questions about in her work, and it's something that, to our knowledge, has only been discussed in one place previously, which is a chapter in the text Disability as Diversity. So we were so excited to see that this manuscript included a discussion of the protocol you use to maintain sterility, and I was hoping that you could talk a little bit more about how you designed that protocol and what resources you used to figure out that process.
Yeah, so I mean, we met with Dr. Jones, and Dr. Brown and I met with the infectious disease specialist at the VA prior to my rotation. And they talked about their concerns. And then we kind of just, like, went we did a visualization, like a step by step of like, okay, Rosa, like, you're rolling in. Okay, so you're going to wash your hands, and then what? And then I would AvaGuard twice. I'd have somebody do the pump, the foot pump. My hands would be sterile, so I would then have somebody push the back of my chair to the scrub tech, and then I would gown and glove up like anybody else would. I would tie up and then be open just in the back and have my gown draped over both my wheels and my lap. And so then I would have whoever was pushing me push me to the surgical field once the surgical field was sterile. And then I would be able to, either depending on how I felt or where I'd want to be, I would have them go underneath my drape or my gown, sorry, and lock me down, lock my brakes, or I would I would not break in, but I would just use a little bit of the table that was in the sterile field to kind of pivot around. But the thing is like once I was in, I couldn't really move large amounts because I couldn't use my hands because that was in the sterile fields. I wouldn't put my hands on my lap, but I would then, if I wanted to move, I would just ask somebody. I would ask whoever's like the circulating nurse or one of the techs to unlock me, and then kind of do the reverse process. And it's not, yeah, it's not like, it's a little bit more limiting, like I will say, compared to other people. But I also recognized pretty early on that like I didn't need to scrub into every single case, because actually for some cases I would get a better visualization of the surgical field and actually be able to see more and have a better experience observing the field if I was not scrubbed in, and then I could maneuver around and kind of look at the surgical field from different views. So I recognize that I would sometimes do that because I'd want to see, if it was a really large patient with a large amount of abdominal adiposity, and they were doing, an open, they're doing an X-lap. For me, like, actually, some of those cases, not all the cases, I would definitely scrub in for some of them and I would hold retraction. But for some of those cases, it was better for me just to not be scrubbed in, and then I could like maneuver around, so I could be, around somebody else's shoulder, and then maneuver around and wheel to the other side so I could get better views of what was going on. I think as the med students, sometimes as med students on our surgery rotation, a lot of times you're like sitting, a lot of other people are just like standing there holding retraction for hours. They're getting really tired. It can be really, hot and uncomfortable, and you get thirsty, and you're supposed to just kind of be on that maneuver the entire time, and sterile. And for me, I was like, hey, like, I don't think I'm going to be able to hold retraction for 3 hours on this abdomen. But that doesn't mean that I can't not be scrubbed in and be able to get better views and ask questions and be asked questions and have a very similar experience. And I think just being flexible, it is not necessary for me to scrub into every single case and hold retraction like everybody else for the entire time. And also that might be prohibitive for some of the other people who are trying to get, into the surgical field. But for me, that was fine. I felt like I learned a lot, sometimes more, because I was able to maneuver around and ask questions and see it from different angles. So
There's a sense in which this is going to sound counterintuitive at first, in which sterility is a social construct. It's partially socially constructed. Now, obviously, something is either sterile or it's not sterile in terms of microbiology, but that actually is not the point of sterile fields. Sterile fields are like a way that they have a buffer between the edge, which is indistinct. The sterile field does not end at the edge of the drape, it ends before the edge of the drape. And I think part of the experience we had with Rosa let us kind of delve into that a little bit and ask ourselves to be a little less rigid about where we consider the edge of the sterile field to be, right? Because like I said, it's not a sharp demarcation. It's usually just sort of some distance. Sometimes it's an elevation, sometimes it's just, linear extension, but it doesn't go all the way to the end of the drape. So where does it go to? You know, Rosa mentioned that she didn't put her hands in her lap. Well, having your hands near your abdomen, if you're standing up, is generally acceptable for the sterile field, and so she would hold her hands up at about the level that a lot of folks' abdomens are if they are standing, and that was deemed acceptable. I just want to bring out that aspect of it because it sounds a little counterintuitive, but it was an interesting realization for me, and I think for a lot of folks.
Yeah, that is really interesting, and I'm glad you brought it up. This idea of how thinking about how to accommodate one student can lead you to reevaluate the broader picture of some things that you've become accustomed to in your work. In your paper is the discussion of technical standards. In the paper, you write, quote, "This also calls into question the restrictive technical standards adopted by most medical schools, which would have precluded our learner from entering medical school. In contrast to most technical standards and with minimal effort, our student experienced rich skill development, one-on-one teaching, and supervision. Very few technical skills and procedures were prohibitive for the student, and when identified, these were easily addressed with proactive planning." So, Jennifer, I'd like to pass this question to you first and hear about how you and Colorado as a whole think about technical standards now.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And we have revised our technical standards in the past couple of years. I think I was recently reviewing them. What we really want our students to do is to talk to us and disclose whatever disabilities they may bring forward. And these may be physical, these may be learning disabilities. These, I think, take a lot of different forms and shapes. But what we want to do is have our students seek accommodations so that we can support them. So in Rosa's case, that was figuring out how to bring the wheelchair into the OR and make it sterile so that she could maximally participate. Those were the accommodations. In other students' cases, those can look really different, but the sooner we know what those disabilities are, we can figure out what accommodations they need. I think in terms of our students with motor disabilities or limitations, we need students to be able to do a physical exam. We need them to be able to perform diagnostic maneuvers. But certainly, I think in a case like Rosa's, there's nothing about her physical disability that would have limited that. We just needed to create sort of the structure and the infrastructure around that to support her in doing that in a bunch of different settings, and how that looked, for example, in psychiatry was pretty different than surgery. So I think having flexibility around that, but writing technical standards so they are as broad as possible is the important piece there, with the idea that we want to bring this diversity into our medical school, because this is what exists out in the world, and this is what makes our medical training rich and our ability to serve our community the best we possibly can. So thinking about this as broadly as possible, and then meeting our students where we can with accommodations.
Rosa, I'd love to hear your thoughts on technical standards as well, from more of a student perspective.
What Jennifer was saying about, like, my student has to do a physical exam. They have to do a physical exam, and then there needs to be a little bit more that needs to be explored a little bit more, because somebody can do a physical exam with the help of an aid, like or a help of other pieces of adaptive equipment. I don't think that those things can even preclude somebody from finishing medical school if they can't, mash on somebody's stomach by themselves, or if they can't hold a stethoscope. And I know this is like I'm only limited to like motor disabilities in my thought process of, because that's the disability that I have. Medical schools need to they need to put their money where their mouths are, to actually have infrastructure for people to be able to be accommodated to meet standards. And standards, I think, also can be loose. Some of these technical standards, they don't really make a lot of sense to me. And then there's no technical standards about not having like incredibly prejudiced ideas. Like, those are things that are not easily screened out of people, and people can go through medical school and have bad ideas and treat people poorly and still become a doctor, right? And I know that's like, that it's not analogous, but I do think about that sometimes, of like, we care so much about if somebody can suture, but we don't have the same thought process when we're making sure that somebody is treating their patients like humans. And I think that, once again, people with disabilities know their own limitations. Not everybody wants to be a cardiothoracic surgeon. That's okay. Like, I don't even think I could be a cardiothoracic surgeon, even if I would have to spend my entire life's energy doing that. And I just I didn't want to do that. That's not worth it to me. But I know that there's so many other things that I am capable of doing. And that's okay. Like, I think this idea that, like, you have to check off all these physical or cognitive boxes the way everyone has to look because you're undifferentiated as a medical student, and we can't make sure that, somebody who can't do a physical or cognitive skill goes into the wrong specialty because they weren't able to do it during medical school. I think that's it's a flawed idea, because like, people with disabilities understand what they can and can't do, and they also people don't, not everybody wants to do these things, and wants to be any type of doctor. Like, people have things and wants and needs that are not just uniformly procedural or physical. So I think there's no way I would want to be an internal medicine doctor, because that's not how my personality and that's not how my brain thinks, right? And I don't know. I mean, it's just about choice, and it's about preference. And
Well, Rosa, I think what I hear you saying is that you're not necessarily against quote unquote technical standards, but you think that there should be a richer conversation about them as opposed to them just sort of being etched in stone and there in a kind of arbitrary manner. Is that fair?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think they need to be flexible. They need to be adaptive, and the institutions need to be able to support them and like have the infrastructure to support that.
Well, and it could even be a conversation that evolves as
Exactly.
technology evolves, right? What about, back when I was taking step 3, they made sure that, I'm not sure if this has changed, but you were not allowed to bring an electronic stethoscope in, right? But if you're hard of hearing or something like that, it's a technical aid that just completely solves that problem. And I'm just using that as an example of a way that a technology could change how we view technical standards.
Absolutely. Yeah, they just need to be adaptive. They really need to be adaptive, um, to the people who the students. And I think I think at Colorado they've done a good job. They've shown that they can do that, right? That they can adapt, they can have these conversations. It's not just this binary. And I just hope that like that is something that can be continued at other institutions.
In the next section, the team discusses the importance and the value of spreading knowledge through academic publication.
One of the things you mention in the end of your paper is how sharing the story is a really important part of the process. In publishing this article, you all have contributed to the resources available about this topic so that now others can learn from you when working with students with physical disabilities in the future. So I wanted to take a moment now to invite you all to speak about how you see this article contributing to broader efforts to accommodate students with disabilities in medical education.
I mean, I think the most important and like the real conclusion of what we did was less about specific modifications and more about having really frank, open, honest conversations, having incredibly good communication, and having willingness to change and to rethink what standards and what qualifies as a specific practice. And I think, like, as Dr. Brown was saying, is that like when he started looking at things and the way things are done, like a lot of times you're just like, you're then starting to rethink why we do a lot of the things we do that aren't really accessible to a lot of people, not just people who use wheelchairs. And I think medicine really is at a tipping point where it needs to figure out how to have that accommodation, and it's a mindset, and have a reckoning of our standards, and are those standards really hindering an expansion of the people who take care of everybody. So I mean, I think that for me was the biggest piece that I took away from this, is that like it's really about communication. It's really about the institutional mindset and reframing your and your institution's thought process around, how things need to look.
I think about this. I've actually thought about you so much recently, Rosa, because we have another student in our clerkships with a very different physical disability who is at one of the hospitals we spent so much time thinking about how to prepare and get everything set up for you. And it went really well for you there too. But lots of engagement with all of the OR staff and thinking about how to make things sterile and all the stuff we talk about in this paper. In contrast, what has happened this year is planning ahead like we did last time. I made a single call and was like, we've got a student coming. And they were like, great, we've got it. We're on it. Okay, no problem. And I was like, okay, do you need anything from me? And they were like, nope, we remember exactly what to do. So when you talk about the tipping point, I think like in many ways you were the tipping point locally, because it just took doing this once and then the story, so to speak, is remembered. And everyone had such a positive experience, I think, working with you and preparing for you. And now the specifics of this case and this student's circumstance are different, but the routine and the acceptance and the like just the normalcy of it are just so natural. So I think that's sort of the legacy that you've left here, which is really impactful. And I think you were the human being here that made that happen. But I think the impact of a paper is that even though they don't get the pleasure of maybe knowing Rosa personally, they can read about it and embrace that same sort of change and just know that this should just be what we do. It's not that big of a deal.
And like medicine, our patients don't like subscribe to a script. That's not how this works. Like, that's not how the world works. And so like we have to be flexible. We have to have humility. We have to be flexible. We have to have an A, a B, a C, a D plan. And we also have to be okay with uncertainty and things not looking the way that you think they're going to look, right? Like, that is life. And I think that was the biggest piece that I got out of it, is just people seeing things and really letting go of this idea of the way things need to be. Because once they have that attitude change, it's things can look differently, you know?
We end all of our episodes with the same question, which is to ask our guests to share any advice they have for our audience. This can be advice for medical students, for residents, for administrators, for practicing physicians with disabilities, really anyone you want to speak to. Rosa, why don't we start with any thoughts you have?
For med students and for residents, I think, if you have the opportunity, finding mentorship, and that's not necessarily a physician with a disability, because there's not a lot of us out there, or, there's becoming more, but I think the big thing is just finding mentorship and finding people who are going to be, advocates for you. And that can take a lot of work, but I think that for me was really important. I think, I have a pretty strong ability to advocate for myself, but also like having the grace and having, the knowledge of when you need to ask for help, and know that, certain things are not your job, and it's a bigger issue, and that those things need to be taken up by other people, I think is really important. And I learned that lesson very quickly. I think feeling like you don't need to be the champion for disability. You get to decide what you want to do and what is within your scope, I think is really important. And I think for administrations and for medical schools and for residency programs, it's like, I think really just taking a look at what your idea of what doctors should look like and really rethinking of like what you guys can do to support people is important. And I think, if programs and medical schools and residencies, don't have the power to advocate for these people, it's like in society, like what other people do, I think we have a lot, we're supposed to have a lot of power and clout as physicians. And I think, yeah, if they can't do it, then I don't really know, who else can. So I think for programs, that's really important, is to really put a lot of effort and a lot of money where your mouth is to make medicine look like the people we serve. I think it's really important. So.
I would agree with that wholeheartedly. I think my take-home message is that there's a really simple question that I think we need to ask at the level of medical education, and that is there a distinction between getting someone an experience as a medical student in a particular rotation versus having them pursue that as a vocation, right, as their profession? And the answer to that is yes. It has to be yes. It is far easier to get somebody, regardless of what their abilities are, an experience on a rotation, and then let them decide whether or not they need the types of accommodations that they foresee are realistic for them in terms of their emotional energy, and capabilities, and et cetera. It doesn't really matter, right? They'll make that decision. As Rosa has said several times, and obviously correctly, people know their limitations, and that's broadly true of everybody. And I mean, okay, there are counterexamples, I admit, but that's one of the goals of living a thoughtful life, right? Is to know your own limitations. And I think folks especially with motor disabilities, are confronted with that in a way that others are not, and they will know what those are, and so they will, by and large, self-select into the kinds of field where they see themselves being welcomed. And I think the first step, and we shouldn't stop there, but the first step is to welcome medical students as medical students into every single rotation that everybody can do.
To our guests, Dr. Malloy Post, Dr. Jones, Dr. Brown, and Dr. Adams, I appreciate you so much, not only for your spirit of inclusion, but for taking the time to share your experiences with our audience and through the literature. You've made an incredible impact on the field by saying, hey, this works, and by demystifying the process for learners and clinical educators alike. You, in your practice and publication, have helped to myth bust the idea that wheelchair users cannot be easily included in medicine. To our audience, thank you so much for joining us for this episode. We encourage you to check out the full article titled Perioperative Clerkship Design for Students with Physical Disabilities, a Model for Implementation, and to subscribe to our podcast so you never miss an episode. As always, I'm grateful for the opportunity to share these stories with you, and I am forever grateful to the storytellers who help us break down stereotypes and stigma with each episode. Thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you next time.